it's right. It's a wonderful script. It's a great idea, especially the judges, and not the main trial, but the judges, because that touches something on which is absolutely unusual. And it took a little bit of courage, and then I said yes. And then I met you, and from then on it was a marriage, as you know.
I don't know whether you remember this, Max. You probably do. But of course, those were the days alive, and anything could happen. And Claude Rains was so moved by one of his final speeches that there were tears in his eyes and he could hardly go on. He was a wonderful man. What a great actor.
And what a great show.
Yes, it was.
I must admit, I mean, George Roy Hill directed it.
Yeah.
And sometimes I thought, my God, maybe the TV show did the play more justice than the film. It was funny, you know, in the TV show, they even had, I think, from the English embassy, a question that Winston Churchill did not say it in 1938 in an open letter to the London Times. It was much earlier.
Right.
And, you know, the line was, and Winston Churchill wrote in an open letter to the London Times in 1938, 1938, Your Honor, if England will. So, and we talked about that, and I was nervous, of course, and it was a live show, Players 90.
Yeah.
So I said, and Winston Churchill said in an open letter to the London Times in 1939, 1939, Your Honor! And George Roy Hill was sitting there and says, well, I guess it was 1939. There's no argument against the power of Max. So it was 1939. But those arguments were, of course, great. And they were written. People always ask me, you know, is it difficult to play Hamlet? It is difficult. But if you say the lines as simple as possible, then you're a good Hamlet. The same is in your work. If you say those lines as simple as possible, it is, in a way, an easy job. I find it much more difficult sometimes a film which explains too much, or you say, but that man who did this and this and this, and you make a whole explanatory moment out. This is very difficult. Sometimes television is very difficult.
You know, I don't think I ever told you this, Max, but when we were going first in a production, there was an aspiring young actor named Marlon Brando that said, I want to do this film, you know, and play the role that Shell had done. And I'll say this for Stanley. He says not only should Max do it, but he deserves to do it. And so, in spite of the extra allure that Brando would have gotten, he insisted on your doing it.
Yeah, but
and I'm so glad he did.
Yeah, but you see how much luck it is to find somebody like you and Stanley to give to a relatively unknown actor such a wonderful part. I mean, acting has to do a lot with luck and chances. You have to grab those chances.
But and that goes for a writer, too, I can tell you.
A writer, too. I mean, the whole business has a lot to do with, not only with craftsmanship, but also with chances, with luck.
Max, let me ask you this. You've worked with so many wonderful people in good plays. Who were some of the most interesting actors that you acted with?
I think Brando was interesting.
In The Young Lions.
In The Young Lions. It wasn't very, I don't think he was so great in Young Lions, but he was an interesting figure.
Yeah.
Interesting personality.
An oddball.
Yes. And I remember that he was very generous to me. For example, in a scene at the Sacré-Cœur on the steps, you know, he suddenly interrupted. He always interrupted. And producers got mad. But he was always right. When he interrupted it, it had a purpose. And he said, well, what about we take a photograph together, the lieutenant and this common soldier. And he says, what about if the lieutenant goes up one step, so he's higher? And we did it, and it worked. So that was his idea. So he was very generous. He didn't care so much about, of course, normal procedures. He just cared if it was good. And Spence was wonderful. He had in his contract that he only had to work, I think, from 9 to 1, and then from 3 to 5. So usually people quietly set up the next shot, you know. Then he says, folks, I don't think you will make it, you know. I'll leave at 5 o'clock. Oh, yes, of course. So one day I had my big speech, and then he came to me and says, listen, it was already over, 5 o'clock. Max, do you need me behind the camera? I said, well, Spence, you need me, I know it. So he stayed next to the camera, and I made the speech. And you know, I was so unknown and a young actor, but he just was wonderful to appreciate what I was doing, and I was very happy that I could speak to him. And then people came and said, Spence, it's time, it's 5 o'clock. I said, for Max, I stay. This is wonderful. You know, this is to be received by an American people, represented by Spence in this case, right. So open and so full of love.
I'll never forget watching with Kramer the clips, and when you said, if my client is guilty, he's not the only one. What about the American industrialists? What about the Vatican?
Yeah, but who wrote that? You.
I wrote it, but you gave it such power. As a matter of fact, watching it with Kramer, Kramer said to me, wow, look at that.
And how did you get the idea to put the play on Broadway?
Well, they came to me. You know, the Tony Randall and the other people. And a lot of people have come to me about it.
The Actors National Theatre.
Yeah, and they said, I like the idea of a national theater. I like the idea if we could have an old Vic in America, you know.
It was close to it.
Yeah, so that's why I agreed to it.
I think it was a good cast.
Yes, yes. And you were so wonderful as Jan, and you were better than Lancaster.
Well, the interesting thing was that when I read the play, I called George Roy Hill, and I said, I would like to play that part of Lancaster. Because when I read the first screenplay, I thought it was the best part. Sit quiet, and then have that wonderful outburst. And then he said, yes, Max, but I think you're too young for a Minister of Justice, which was true.
Yeah.
So then when you said you would do it on Broadway, I said, I think we should keep that pattern, that a young man should be defense counsel. But now I'm ready to play the Minister of Justice. so we switched the roles.
Right.
It was interesting. The play was the same play, but still it took on a different term.
Right.
Which I enjoyed very much.
The biggest amount of lies were told about Judgment at Nuremberg. And I hope we let a little light come through. That's worth everything, you know. And I'll always be so grateful to you, Max, for everything you gave it.
It was accompanying me.
Yeah.
It changed my life. The TV show already. I had the great privilege to work with you and George Roy Hill, and also Claude Rains.
Yeah.
And Melvyn Douglas.
Right.
And Paul Lucas,
right.
who played the part of Lancaster. And then, of course, when you and Stanley decided that I could do the film, and when you win an Oscar, this is, you're breaking somehow the borders, you know, you're going out into the world, and it's also a great obligation to do some good things. And then when you came with the idea to do a play on Broadway, I thought, oh, I should participate in it, and then I played the Janning. So it accompanied me my whole life. And I'm glad it's coming out now again.
Yes.
And you got even, you're among the best screenplays of the year and the decade even. So for us it was, I think, very decisive.